So, ladies and gentlemen, now we would like to open this symposium, and please join us in welcoming this year's Holberg laureate, Professor Fredric Jameson.
Thanks so much, Sarah and Xiaobing. I'm, of course, enormously grateful for this distinction, and I'm also very pleased that so many friends and colleagues have been able to come to it. I think maybe the best way one can respond to these honors is perhaps to try to push on into new intellectual areas, and I would like to do that, try to do that a little this morning in what I have to say. In fact, this brief intervention, don't know if I have to hold this, huh? Do I? No. Do not?
There is a thing here.
This brief intervention was suggested by my perplexity in the face of an interview question. These were the original interviews that I did with people from the committee in Toronto last fall. In the face of an interview question which asked me about the significance of international prizes such as this one. So I want now to say what I think that significance is, but I'm going to divide my answer into two parts. I'll answer the general version of the question now and reserve a remark about this Holberg International Memorial Prize in particular for tomorrow. And the title of this is something like, Does World Literature Have a Foreign Office? In a general way, today, the International Prize forces us to raise again the question of nations and the relationship of national literatures to each other. And I'll include the recipients of this Holberg Prize under literature following Goethe's idea that what he called world literature, I'll come back to that, was essentially a network or relationship of different national critics and thinkers among each other, above and beyond the translation of purely literary texts. But does the nation state still exist under globalization? And what can be the status of so-called world literature in that new global system? Would it be governed by something like a literary United Nations? So I want to say something about the nation today, and then about literary value, and finally about relationship as such, which according to me has to be grasped in terms of otherness and negativity. The national is preeminently the place of the dialectical union of opposites, the space where the opposites coincide. The national is thus, on the one hand, the space of the most abominable ethnic cleansing, of bigotry and xenophobia in their narrowest and most provincial forms. Everyone will think of their contemporary examples to the point at which it seems almost obscene to undertake a celebration of nationalism in any form whatsoever today. Yet the national is also the figure for collectivity as such, whether we're talking about language, tribal or ethnic solidarity, or any other form of group or communal spirit. Indeed, class itself, the one collective category which seems to achieve universality independently of any of those categories, has most often, in all modern revolutions without exception, also been expressed in nationalist terms, or perhaps we might say that class solidarity has co-opted and appropriated the nationalist impulses. At any rate, it's worth affirming over against the various national, it's worth affirming as over against the various individualist ideologies that the very form of the group and the collective is always worth celebrating, is always positive, and this certainly holds for the great nationalist movements. Although perhaps we need to add Deleuze's proviso that the group or the national is always to be supported until it comes to power, until it achieves its nationalist ends, at which point it tends to swing back into its opposite, the tyranny of the majoritarian group, not so much over individuals as over the new minoritarian ones. I need to complete this picture of the dialectical ambivalence of the national with three observations. First, the nation still very much persists within globalization and is an essential component of it. And this for one simple reason, which is that it serves as the alibi for corporate oppression. The businessmen must be able to say, in order for England or Germany or the United States to remain competitive on the world market, workers must accept a cut in salary, a diminution of the social benefits, the now infamous give back. The nation thus serves as the ironclad argument for the neoliberal dismantling of the welfare state. Second, we must not only understand the national in terms of jingoism and collective conceit, it is in fact far more the place of the national wound, of the national misère, of the most intense forms of the national inferiority complex, and thereby of ressentiment and humiliation. The smaller and more economically and globally marginal the country, the more intense is this unique taste of the national in its citizens' mouths, the more sour the limits of their collective identity feelings. This is what explains the formal necessity of national allegory. Whatever the existential contents of the individual story or experience, it will always carry with it the overtones of this national subalternity. It will always be allegorical of the national misery. But as one approaches the center and the superstate, the more easy is it for its citizens to know the blindness of the center, to think of themselves as in uniquely private terms, to forget the national relations, the foreign relations which also define them, but which now, as we might put it, define them unconsciously and can be repressed and forgotten, a relief not possible in other parts of the world. There is then very much a national level to our existential experience, however apparent it may or may not be. But in my opinion, it's always a great mistake to try to theorize these matters I've been talking about in ideological terms of national identity or national culture. And as a third or final comment, I'll say that as a response to this vexed question of the terms national, nation, nationalism, and so forth, particularly in my use of them here as synonyms for any kind of collectivity or group ethos, I will propose the more cumbersome but more precise formula of the national situation, an expression which very much includes these experiences of what I've called the national misery or national subalternity. Indeed, I think the notion of a national situation goes a long way towards rendering more coherent and more serviceable what Goethe called world literature. If you read his enigmatic statements closely, you see that they don't so much aim at characterizing the world fame of Lord Byron or the newly discovered universality of the Shakuntala or of Persian poetry, so much as the emergence of what we may call institutions of cultural communication, the Revue des Deux Mondes, the Edinburgh Review, Le Globe, and so on and so forth, vehicles through which a foreigner can approach the national situation of a given country, including its literary and intellectual situation. What are the debates going on in this specific national situation? What are the concepts available to its intellectuals to articulate that situation? What literary forms respond to its needs or emerge in solutions to its dilemmas and contradictions? This is why I've proposed elsewhere, you see, Sarah, I do refer to myself, why I've proposed elsewhere to replace the old two-term model of reader and text with a four-term one, especially in the context of international relations, but also in terms of history in the past. It's not a question of a reader of one country or period developing or inventing some immediate relationship to the text of another one, Goethe's reading of Lord Byron, say, or Pound's reading of the Provençal troubadours. This is rather a fourfold relationship in which the reader of one national situation achieves such contact with the text of another by way of the mediation of a relationship between two national situations. The national situation of provincial Germany enters into contact with the national situation of an emergent imperial Britain, and it's only by way of that relationship that the individual of the former can hope for any ultimate contact with the texts which express the latter, obviously by way of revolt and scandal in the case of Lord Byron. It's no longer here a question of a classic or a universal literature. This is a complex contact between histories and concrete historical situations. And if this idea seems to perpetuate the old teleological conceptuality of the more advanced or the less developed, I think it does so only to undermine that teleology as well. For what must finally here emerge is the radical singularity and concrete difference of each of those situations. None is more advanced along the teleological pathway to modernity. Each is marked as universally determined and specific, which is to say uniquely national. Now, I think, well, here, one of the problems that misleads us here is the philosophical problem of aesthetic value, in my opinion, a false problem. It masks, indeed, a far more thorny philosophical problem, a real one this time, which turns on the opposition between universal and particular. For when humanist critics raise the question of value, what they really have in mind is universal value, and it's out of the notion of universal value that an antiquated and unserviceable notion of world literature has always come. I think this emphasis on universal value is wrong and misguided. It's unproductive even within the Western canon, giving rise to all kinds of false problems and questions like the following. Is Faulkner greater than Haldor Loxness, or vice versa? Is either greater than Tolstoy? Which is more universal, I Promessi Sposi or Red Chamber Dream? I won't pursue these silly questions any further here, except to say that they follow the Querelle des Anciens et des Modernes of the 17th century on into the discovery of history and difference, and that the question of value is itself a historical one, which arises only after the fact and does not involve classification according to a priori categories. Rather than a transcendental dimension in which works share the same, henceforth universal values, I propose that we attempt to think of the enigmatic realm we call world literature as a space and site of struggle, of competition and opposition. The literary struggle can here first of all be grasped in terms of the struggle between big power languages and small power languages, and to be sure in terms of the control of the institutions of translation and transmission, publishing companies, universities, even still occasionally the cultural press, which regulate that struggle. But the question of big powers and small powers obviously brings us back squarely to the problem of the nation. I want here to propose a model of the dialectical unity of opposites and insist on the way in which a text can be evaluated in positive and negative terms simultaneously. But I want first to pay homage to that book which I consider to have been a foundational work for a whole new comparative literature, assuming that we agree with Franco Moretti's observation that the question of world literature is the same as the question about comparative literature as such. For Pascal Casanova's La République mondiale des lettres, the World Republic of Letters, insists strongly on the antagonistic relationality between post-colonial and metropolitan literatures, and also on the mediatory role of a third player, namely Paris, as a kind of gold standard, if not universal bank, through which these antagonistic values are discounted and processed through a kind of currency exchange with each other. I regret I have no time to discuss this extraordinary and path-breaking work further here. I'm going to conclude by suggesting that some of the problems, excuse me, I want to suggest some of the problems that arise when we see world literature not in terms of the value of a single great or classical text, but rather as a relationship between national productions, one that can be antagonistic or dissonant, fully as much as it can be harmonious and somehow positive, that can involve difference fully as much as identity. So I would like us to imagine the following hypothetical possibilities. First, imagine a work of art which emerges from a generally nativist context, which expresses the values, I have that in quotation marks, of the national tradition and its uniqueness, its superiority over foreign and imported models, and which affirms the autonomy or the need for autonomy of the national culture and its rejection of imports, as well as its contempt for alien artworks and foreign ways of life. This is then a work of art which wishes to be absolutely particularist and to affirm its radical difference from those of other countries and its superiority over them. A work of this kind then wishes to be the opposite of universal, except insofar as this particular nativism might affirm itself as the only truly human form of life and culture. And if this nativism coincides with a national state form already achieved or longed and struggled for, then the work in question will generally be considered to fall under the rubric of nationalism, and to raise all the problems associated with that ideology. But you're then also asked to imagine that this particular work has found worldwide acclamation and admiration. The international public then adds it to its pantheon of world literature and endows it with a nimbus of the world classic and of universality. This paradoxical result might be achieved in several different ways. The international public can, for example, choose to ignore the nationalistic and particularistic spirit and meaning of the work on the grounds that its political bias is irrelevant to its aesthetic qualities. Or it can simply misunderstand the work and fail to recognize its ideological and contextual significance for the home public. Or it can indeed argue that it is precisely its wrong-headed nationalistic passion, its situation-centeredness, its commitment to the concrete and to the blood and soil of the homeland, which makes for its force and its value as an example to the rest of the world. This would also be a misreading, since it substitutes for the unique national reference the allegedly universal value of the national in general, the homeland in general, the unique native tradition in general. So we have here a most peculiar situation indeed. What is positive in one context is negative in the other. What wishes passionately to be particular on one level suddenly proves to be universal on another. What was rabidly ethnocentric is now saluted as part of the heritage of all mankind. To sharpen the paradox a little, we might speak of the deeper humanism of genocide, or the compassion of bigots, and the progressive values of the most ignorant reactionaries. Now I want to reverse my first illustration and ask you to imagine a national literature in which, rather than singularity in the local or national, it is universality that's emphasized, perhaps in the name of classicism, or perhaps in that of some eternal humanism. A national aesthetic of this kind might well be projected in the name of some identification of the national character or vocation with human nature itself, or on the basis of an association of the national tradition with reason and clarity and the lack of specific national characteristics or idiosyncrasies in the first place. Yet we may also imagine that on the world stage, in a polyphony of distinct and colorful styles and artistic languages, this particular classicism might well be found to be abstract and insipid, without any great international appeal, and indeed in a paradoxical reversal, simply taken as the local expression of some incomprehensible collective taste for an unadorned purity of little interest to the rest of the world. Here, universality itself becomes just another particularity, while implicitly it's particularity which comes to see universal in some richly multicultural world bizarre. Indeed, we could make a case for modernism itself as staging such a paradoxical situation in which it is the local and the singular which becomes universal and which then discards the pretensions of some universal world aesthetic standard to the historical ashcans of the boring and the old-fashioned and the outmoded. Modernism would then be a uniquely dialectical phenomenon in which it is precisely the commitment to the private, the local, or even the idiosyncrasies of a specific national culture, which is now alone capable of acceding to the abstractions, the necessarily abstract realm of the universal, that very singularity in language or in imagery or content, which is closed to us as foreigners, then becomes the seal and sign of this universal value of all art, of such art, while the attempt to contribute to world literature as such, to fashion a world which in its universal experience and its expression of the eternally human is dismissed as a humanism utterly without interest and without the vocal power and resonance capable of carrying it across international borders. There is a suggestive political parallel here which I take to be structural in nature, if not in content, and I have just a few more pages here. This is the disjunction between the realms of domestic and foreign policy, which are almost never homologous or isomorphic, but tend to stand in inverted ratio to each other. I think we're familiar in various places with the situation in which the domestic policy of a given administration could be judged progressive, while its foreign policy is quite the reverse and can be characterized as repressive. But the opposite is also true, and we've sometimes been able historically to observe a reactionary regime with a progressive foreign policy. I think this is because in personal identity as well as in the external world, these two dimensions, the subjective or existential one and the objective relation with the other, collective relations as opposed to individual ones, today miss each other like different planes in infinite space, although one can certainly imagine worlds or historical moments in which this would not necessarily be the case. So also, I believe, with the foreign policy of literature, so to speak, as opposed to its domestic one. The only way of thinking these two incommensurable realities together without collapsing one into the other is the dialectic, one of whose functions is precisely to conceptualize what is thus contradictory or non-thinkable. Works thus function simultaneously on at least two different levels, as it were, its foreign policy level and its domestic one. A work emits two messages simultaneously. It's at one and the same time about itself and about the world, an autoreferential designation and a new construction of language, the psyche, the situation as such. And in that Darwinian process, which as Franco Moretti has shown us is as fruitful a figurative reference for literature as the market, the work must wage a dual struggle. As a formal mutation, it must attempt to survive in its own internal habitat or ecosystem, and also affirm itself outside on the world scale against its competitors from other countries who are as hungry for recognition and species perpetuation as it is itself. But as we've shown, these two simultaneous struggles may involve quite different and sometimes incompatible strategies. The Althuserians used to talk not about proposing solutions, but about producing problems. I don't feel that I've done much more than that today. On the other hand, they also thought that to produce a problem was better than any of the solutions one might invent for it, and I'm reassured by that belief. Yet if I haven't solved anything here, these considerations have at least put me in a better position to try to answer the original question I found myself confronted with, namely the significance of international prizes of this kind. And I conclude in this way: the older system of prizes sought to establish universal values, a literary canon, for example, valid for the whole world, in such a way that the classics of the smaller language countries or the non-Western ones were afforded their rightful place among the more generally acknowledged big power Western masterpieces. Now, however, what any concept of world literature must include is the operation not only of radical difference and of opposition, but also of dialectical ambivalence as well as of unevenness and canonical inequality, if I may put it that way. Therefore, the emergence of such awards from non-central countries and non-hegemonic locations, from Stockholm or Bergen, for example, rather than from Paris, London, or New York, has the effect of suddenly lighting up the international grid, of unexpectedly mapping literary globalization for us, of confronting us not with some universalizing solution, but rather with an ongoing problem, the problematic of the nature of global relationships and their structure and dynamics today. World literature is then not some already given pantheon or imaginary museum to which masterpieces are regularly added. It is another name for a problem and a conundrum. How can differences relate today? How can nationality be universal? How can global multiplicity be imagined without a center? Thank you.